Hey everyone. Oh dear, wait, I didn't put in my microphone. Let's make that better. Oh crap. Okay, there we are. So I did a presentation today, about an hour and a half, for the American Research Center in Egypt. And I know you guys didn't get to participate in that because of the 48-hour notice, etc. So I thought that I could reach out to you today, and I didn't get a whiskey in hand for the first one. Here we are. So I thought, and I apologize with my whole Irish heart for the ice. But if I don't do ice right now, you guys, I don't even want to talk about it. I don't know what's going to happen if I don't do ice. So I have to do ice. So I know it goes against all the rules, but this is what we got to do. So there's ice. So since you guys didn't get to see it, here's what I did. I mean, it was an hour and a half, so bear with me. But, you know, evidence of reuse, right? And then I did a whole story with this photo. Like, imagine that you are in the Bronze Age collapse, which of course you don't call the Bronze Age collapse, because who calls the thing that it is while you're in the thing? And you have to bury your mother. And how do you bury your mother when you can't get access to a coffin? And that you go into the burial chamber and you find a coffin of great Aunt Bertha, whom you have never met and don't know. And you take her coffin out and you bring that coffin to the workshop, and you're like kind of embarrassed, and you're like, can you guys like use this coffin to bury our mom? And we're so sorry. And the workmen are like, the craftsmen are like, yeah, everyone's doing that, no problem. So it brings up cultural agreement, brings up scarcity and crisis. And then I have this scary slide up, no stress, but about coffin use and reuse and what it means. This is what I've been doing for the last 12 or so years. The short answer to how anyone would reuse a coffin of a dead person, how it can be moral at all, is that number one, it's the only moral solution if you believe that you need to transform the dead and put them into the other life as something greater than what they were. It is the only moral solution. And number two, it creates the understanding that the ancient Egyptians thought in terms of temporary ownership of these coffins, not in forever ownership of these coffins. And we assume, because we have so many things in museums from Egypt, every museum in the United States that has an ancient collection has something Egyptian. The Louvre, the British Museum, even Istanbul. I mean, there are Egyptian things all over the world, right? Turin, etc. We could go on. And because of all this Egyptian stuff, we assume that the Egyptians could always build something out of anything, that they were rich beyond belief, and that any dead person would get to keep a coffin forever. And my research about coffin reuse reveals that that is not the case. So that's interesting. And then I talked about, this way, defensive burial. There, can you see that? A little better? There we go. And about how you move from a time period in dynasties 18 and 19 in which you mark the grave, you show where the dead are buried, you give them furniture, you give them statues, see that one right there, you give them a pyramidion above their grave, you give them all kinds of great things, you give them, in the 18th dynasty, furniture and sheets and shirts and sandals and makeup and everything. But you give them all of these things and you mark the grave, and you go from that to a more defensive strategy of death in Dynasty 21 with the Bronze Age collapse, in which you're like, you know what, we don't need to mark the grave. Nobody needs to know where anybody is buried. We need to not show that. And you condense everything into a coffin space, and I call this defensive burial. So these are all the coffins that I have visited over the years. All the museums, you can't see the spreadsheet, but it's fine. And then I got to Deir-El-Bahari tomb 320, and I show this picture of, and let me make sure I get this right. I have to tilt it down. That's my husband Remy Hiramoto on a motorcycle at Deir-El-Bahari in front of Hatshepsut's temple of millions of years, because he met some Egyptian dude who knew a dude, and then Remy decided to ask him, can I ride your motorcycle? That's my husband riding a motorcycle. So we talked about Deir-El-Bahari and where it's located. The best picture, I think, for you guys right now, if I can get it to show up, is that one. Reuse of an 18th dynasty tomb. I know it's not completely clear, and I do apologize. Oops, and I went to the next slide, and that's fine. And this is where the high priests of Amun were buried, and where and they were reusing an 18th dynasty tomb. So they buried themselves there, and they took the kings of the 18th, 19th, well, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties and brought those bodies in to be buried with them. Not all of them, but many of them. And then I separated the coffins into groups, and I showed this cool chart, which gives you an idea that from here, let's just show the bottom of it, from the 19th to the 20th to the 21st dynasty, you see an increase in reuse. Really with the 20th dynasty, it just blows up. This is when the Bronze Age collapse is part of the world, and the coffin reuse just goes off the charts. And coffin reuse, people are like, how can you separate a body from the container in which the body is dwelling? How can you even do that? How is it moral? Well, if that body inside the coffin has already been transformed into Osiris or the sun god Re or whatever it is you believe, or both, and they're already in they have been transformed in their way, you can lay that body to the side. You could bring a priest or a magician into the tomb, do spells to make sure that the dead don't rise up as angry beings and come and get you, and then you can take that coffin out for the use of somebody else. And in many ways, it is the only moral thing to do, to separate that body from the coffin. Now, for the coffins within Deir-El-Bahari 320, the ones that I examined, we talked about the rate of reuse within this. Oh my God, can't see it at all. That's horrible. No colors show up. There we go. Do you see the pie chart, kind of? You can get an idea. I will just tell you what that slide says, that I have strong evidence that 80% of the Deir-El-Bahari 21st dynasty coffins were reused, and the other 20% were probably reused too, but the evidence is not as strong. So we have that. The other thing I wanted to point out in this talk is that when you have access to something, like here I don't have access, right? I'm looking through a glass case. I'm kind of mashing my face up against the glass. I can't figure out what is going on. I'm trying to shine a flashlight through plexiglass. This is not an easy thing for me to do. And so if you don't have access, you don't have all of the data. And when you do have all of the data, like in the Cairo Museum, where I can take the coffins out and I can see everything, then I get a better understanding of reuse, which means that just because the Deir-El-Bahari coffins show a higher rate of reuse compared to coffins from other museums doesn't mean that they necessarily have a higher rate of reuse, just that I can see it better. So my data overall still shows that in the 19th dynasty, reign of Ramses II, there's not a whole lot of reuse. There's still prosperity in Egypt. And in the reigns of Ramses III, Dynasty 20, and then going into Dynasty 21, reuse just keeps going up and up and up. And everyone in Egypt seems to have a cultural agreement that coffin reuse is what they need to do. And when I say everyone, let me be very clear that I'm talking about the top 5% of the ancient Egyptian population who could afford coffins at all. So, let's see, I showed some pictures of us working on the coffins with microscopes and other fancy equipment, which is kind of cool. And I talked about the kinds of reuse. And let me give you just a few examples of coffin reuse so you get an idea of what we're talking about. And this is one of my favorites. So let's see if you guys can see that. So can you see this is my marking up on my own notes, where you can see that the coffin size, you see the thickness of the coffin size, and I know it's blurry, but the Cairo Museum will want me to make it blurry anyway because they don't want their photos to be out. It's their copyright, so that's fine. But notice how thin around the shoulders of this coffin case those case sides are. See where my red lines are? See where the arrows are saying that this has been cut back from the inside? It has indeed. And so that means that they have carved out the inside of that piece ostensibly to place another coffin piece inside. That they had two coffins that they didn't necessarily, they couldn't necessarily fit together, and that this piece, and that this piece couldn't fit the smaller piece on the inside, and so they had to cut it back. And the amount of modifications you see are extraordinary. And then you have decoration on the inside after they cut the inside of this piece back. And you see this on mummy boards, you see it on outer coffins, you see it on inner coffins, you see all kinds of amazing things. Other examples of reuse. Here, I'll show you some examples of name reuse. Do you see one name has been carved out and another name has been put in its place? This is reuse that you can see very, very clearly, even if you're in the funerary cortege, you're watching as an audience member from the side, you're gonna look at the coffin go by and be like, wait a minute, I can see that name has been rubbed out and another name's been put in its place, huh? But you know you're doing it and they're doing it. And it's interesting that when I see more obvious cases of reuse, it's generally for women. I'll leave that there. That's complicated. That's complicated. Let's see. Plaster modification is pretty clear, but I like this one. Okay, so you can have reuse wood as well. So I need both pictures to be in this image here. Let me tilt it down because that works best. Okay, so do you see on the left, that's Henatawi's coffin, and you see my red circles. And there are these weird inlays of wood, reused wood, I would argue, from a coffin that already had glass inlays in it. On the right is a coffin from KV 63 that was published by Otto Schaden. And those are glass bars that are fit into that coffin for the central text inscription. So what I think happened is a coffin like that, the wood of it was reused and then reused for an 18th dynasty coffin that went like this, was reused as a piece and put like this into make a 21st dynasty coffin. So it's pretty amazing. There is also theft, and there you can see faces and hands having been ripped off of a coffin, gilding of all kinds having been ripped off of a coffin. When the Egyptians ripped off hands and faces from these cache burials, it's really interesting to see that they take the hands and faces from the inner pieces rather than the outer pieces. So imagine that all of these coffin sets are in your burial chamber like Russian nesting dolls. And you want to steal some stuff, you need some cash, you're in there with 3 other guys, and you're like, hey, you guys, you want to take the hands and face of this piece here? And they're like, yeah, okay. I mean, we could do that. We're burying so-and-so, so let's go ahead and do it. And you open up the outer piece, you take out those inner pieces, and you rip off the hands and face of those inner pieces, and you bring those to the market after you take the gold off of it. You don't want them to see that it's a coffin piece, perhaps. You take the gold off of it, but you put the lid of the outer coffin back on so that the next people in your family or your neighborhood or your group who go into that burial chamber, when they see that coffin set, they have no idea that you have been inside of that coffin set to steal those hands and faces. So the rich are stealing from each other. They're reusing from each other. That's how bad the scarcity is at the Bronze Age collapse around 1200, 1100, 1000 BCE. This goes on for some time. And this gives us an idea that coffins and burial chambers and burial spaces are not necessarily meant to be forever. They are meant to be temporary. They are meant to be of the moment. They are meant to be display to show off how much wealth you have. They are meant to be transformational so that the dead can be ritually turned into something that will help you as they go to the next life and you need them to help you. So it just, again, makes the Egyptians less alien-like, less otherworldly, and much more like us. So that's a brief synopsis of what I talked about for the RC chapters. And let's see what you guys have to say. Let's see, KV64 usurped tomb of Lady Nechmes Bastet. Yeah, that's a 22nd dynasty tomb. This is Allie Emily Stewart. So she's talking about a 22nd dynasty interment put into a space that was not meant for her. And the coffin itself, I haven't been able to examine that coffin, so I don't know if the coffin itself was reused, but the burial place was certainly reused. Hello from Egypt. Hi. Going to start an undergraduate degree at York University, studying 2 years part-time in England. We have a module on mummification. You know, I'm not a mummification expert, so I know the basics, but I don't work with it I don't work with mummies. And when I see a mummy in a coffin, I say, oh, hello. And then I leave it for the bioarchaeologist because that's not my jam. I do other things. Can we please talk about Pharaoh Pepi and his 90-year reign sometime, but maybe not this time. But let's see what we can do. Any other questions earlier? Let's see. What a new, interesting, and compelling live. Ancient Egypt is always fascinating. Thank you, Danielle. Remy is a badass, yeah. Thanks, Paula. He really is. If anyone's going to get a motorcycle to ride in front of Deir-El-Bahari, it's going to be my husband, Remy. Second husband, I think there's something to that. And I should also do a shout out to Carrie Arbuckle McLeod, who took that photo. And when he saw it at the end of the day, I'm like, oh, this photo is making it into academic PowerPoints because you can't get better than that. That was pretty awesome. In Germany, you only rent your gravesite, says Jeffrey Miller. They believe in recycling. Well, it's funny. You know, every now and then you'll read the newspaper and people are like, they moved the gravestones, they moved the bodies. How could they do this? And it's pretty funny that people think that we have an infinite amount of space for the almost 8 billion people we have on our planet who all need to be buried when they die, and no one gets out of this life without dying. So every cemetery needs to move bodies, needs to consolidate space. This is just the way it is. And the fact that we haven't looked at this for Egypt until now, I find rather stunning, but it gives me lots to do. And I know now a lot about wood craftsmanship and plaster and paint and varnish and all kinds of weird things that no normal person needs to know about. Yeah, video keeps pausing for me too, and I'm sorry. I agree. Let's see. Facebook's autofill. Yeah, I get a weird bar saying low network connection, and I apologize. Hi from Louisiana. Hope you guys are okay. Hello from the Houston Astronomical Society. That's fancy. Terrific RC presentation this afternoon, North Texas chapter. Thank you so much. Who was the original occupant of Deir-El-Bahari? Oh, I don't want to answer that, Rob Roy. Why would I want to answer that? And we'll end with this. This will be our last question. We'll make it a nice, tight 20-minute Facebook Live. But that tomb fits with everything. That tomb is almost certainly an 18th dynasty tomb. That's what the architecture seems to point to. And it's probably a queen's tomb of some kind, important, up high on the cliffside, at that very important place in Deir-El-Bahari connected to the Hathor cult and other such ritual spaces. And the fact that it's reused in Dynasty 21 or at the beginning of Dynasty 22 fits with all of the reuse of the coffins that we see therein. And don't forget that these 21st Dynasty high priests were buried in this reused burial sepulcher, took with them the bodies that were all stripped of all of their riches and piously rewrapped and placed into other coffins. They took the bodies of Ramses II, Amenhotep II, I think Ramses IV is in there too, Thutmose III, the coffin of Thutmose I at least. They took all of those kings with them into their tomb. So there they are with their wives and their daughters, and they're there with the kings of Egypt as well. Ramses II, he's in there. Those are brought into the tomb with them. So while everyone's reusing, And everyone, at least the people in charge of Thebes at the time, were systematically opening the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and reusing the riches within those royal spaces. They still are trying to display and have a respect for the authority of the kings that preceded them, and they're trying to connect with that great power that they themselves don't have, because Egypt has been thrown into disarray. You don't have the political unification that you did before in dynasties 18 and 19. Now in dynasties 20, 21, 22, things are much more problematic. So those high priests, by collecting those kings' bodies and burying themselves with those kings' bodies, are trying to connect with that power. So an oversimplified view, and apologies for the low quality of my Wi-Fi, and we will connect again maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, and I'll talk about the things that are on my brain now, which is populism, because I'm doing the class on divine kingship and authoritarianism. And now that I'm in the Ramses II week, I think populism is where I need to go. I need to define it in my mind, and I need to think about what that means. And it seems improper in a way to think of a divine king as having populist tendencies, that he would even need something like that. And yet for Ramses II, I think it fits. So you guys can tell me what you think when I talk about populism. Maybe I should try to talk about it tomorrow, so I'll have more of my lecture prepared than not. It would probably be best. And we'll connect again. So hang tight, and we'll be in touch. Bye, you guys.